Hello, my friends. My name is Robert Morgan, or Caesar. Greetings to all my colleagues at the channel, both old and new. To avoid any misunderstanding, this channel is a radio station with many content creators. So, if you'd like to hear me again, go to the channel in the playlist under the name Robert Morgan. Welcome to The Meat Grinder. I've seen my fair share of blood. Serving as an army surgeon, you get used to human flesh ripped apart by shrapnel, bone fragments sticking out of mud, and men screaming for mothers who ain't ever coming. But what went down at Riddling Thorpe Manor that night? That wasn't just violence. That was a sick, twisted showcase of pure psychopathy. The air inside the room was suffocating, thick with the sharp stench of burnt gunpowder, copper, and the lingering odor of burnt hair. Me and Holmes were standing smack in the middle of a slaughterhouse. Blood wasn't just spilled. It was smeared, splattered across the wallpaper like some abstract painting executed by a lunatic's gallery. Elsie was down on the hardwood floor, pinned against the baseboard, her head blown open by a close-range heavy-gauge slug. Brain matter and crimson pooled around her hair like a halo. Right next to her sat her husband, Hilton Cubitt. Half his chest collapsed from a double-tapped shotgun blast that literally ripped his ribs inside out. You'd think a normal human being would freeze, puke, or call for the damn cops. But Sherlock Holmes? The man didn't even flinch. He stood right there in the gore, a faint, terrifying smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. He wasn't looking at the dead bodies. He was staring at a torn sheet of butcher paper pinned to the wall with a rusty pocket knife. On that paper, drawn in thick, drying human blood, were tiny stick figures, childish little men dancing, holding hands, waving flags. Holmes reached out, touched the wet crimson figure, brought his finger to his nose, and took a slow, deep breath. He leaned in close to my ear and whispered in that cold, mechanical tone that always gave me the chills. "We swallowed the wrong bait, Watson. The real slaughter hasn't even started yet. Welcome to the freak show." If you want to understand how two sane men walked straight into this psychological meat grinder, you gotta turn back the clock. You gotta go back 7 days, to the precise moment when the first red envelope landed on our table at Baker Street. The worst part was that the room didn't feel empty. Every instinct in my body told me somebody was still watching us. The dead were silent, but the silence itself seemed to have a pulse. Somewhere behind the wallpaper, something creaked. I turned my head toward the sound, expecting to see a shadow move across the doorway. Nothing, just darkness. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the killer had left something behind besides bodies. It felt like a presence, invisible but deliberate, standing just outside the reach of our vision and waiting for one of us to notice. Holmes seemed to sense it too. His smile disappeared for a second. He slowly looked toward the hallway, his expression becoming strangely serious. I watched his eyes move from corner to corner, calculating distances, exits, hiding places. Then he looked back at the dancing men. He didn't speak. That frightened me more than anything else. Holmes always had an explanation. If he was silent, it meant he had discovered something he didn't yet understand. Back then, I thought Holmes was just an eccentric genius with a bad habit of shooting holes in the plaster. I didn't know he was a monster waiting for a bigger monster to come knocking. The storm outside Baker Street was howling like a dying dog, rattling the glass panes while the coal fire spat sparks across the rug. Holmes hadn't slept in 3 days. He was pacing back and forth like a caged predator, his knuckles raw, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. He didn't track crimes for justice. He consumed them like a fix. When the world was quiet, Holmes deteriorated. He needed the filth, the sickness, the depravity of human nature to keep his own dark mind from eating itself alive from the inside out. I remember watching him that night and wondering how long a man could stare into darkness before the darkness started staring back. Holmes didn't answer when I asked if he was all right. He simply stopped beside the window and watched the rain crawl down the glass. For a moment, his reflection looked like another man standing behind him. I almost called his name. Then the reflection moved a fraction later than Holmes did. I blinked and it was gone. I told myself I was exhausted. I told myself the storm and the lack of sleep were playing tricks on me. But deep down, something had already changed. 7 days before Riddling Thorpe Manor became a graveyard, I had the first feeling that whatever we were about to face wasn't simply a criminal with a gun. It was something that wanted to get inside our heads. Outside, London was a muddy, soot-choked hellhole, but inside 221B, Baker Street, the silence was worse. It was heavy, razor-sharp, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring until you start hearing voices. Holmes was curled up in the corner of his wingback chair, his hands stained with acid and printer's ink, aggressively rubbing his temples. He hadn't touched a plate of food in 48 hours. He lived off black coffee, cheap tobacco, and the dark thrill of human misery. Then came the crash at the front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a desperate, panicked pounding, like a man running from a pack of starved wolves. Downstairs, Mrs. Hudson screamed as the heavy oak door was kicked inward. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, heavy and uncoordinated. The door to our sitting room kicked open, and in stumbled Hilton Cubitt. The guy was a big Norfolk country gentleman, built like an ox, but right now he looked like a broken ghost. His clothes were soaked through with freezing rain, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale as lard. His hands were shaking violently as he reached inside his drenched coat and pulled out a faded red envelope. He slammed it onto the mahogany table, nearly knocking over my oil lamp. "She's slipping away, Mr. Holmes." Cubitt gasped, his voice raspy, cracking under raw terror. "My wife, Elsie, she's losing her mind. This damn thing is eating her alive from the inside out." Holmes slowly lifted his head. His eyes, usually sharp and calculated, lit up with a dangerous, predatory glint. He pulled the paper out of the red envelope. It wasn't a ransom note. It wasn't a blackmail threat. It was a strip of coarse parchment featuring a line of crude, drawn stick figures, little dancing men with oversized heads, some inverted, some holding tiny flags. To any normal beat cop, it looked like a toddler's crayon scribble. But Holmes didn't see child's play. He saw a psychological blueprint of a maniac. Cubitt leaned over the table, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and cold sweat. He explained how he had married Elsie, an American girl with a dark, secretive past she refused to talk about. Everything was fine until a week ago, when the first scribble appeared carved into the sundial in their garden. Since that morning, Elsie transformed into a complete psycho. She stopped sleeping. She'd wake up in the dead of night, crouched in the corner of the bedroom, chewing her own fingernails down to the raw quick until blood trickled down her wrists. She'd stare into the dark corners of the room, wide-eyed, muttering names of dead men from Chicago, men who had been chopped up, burned, or buried in concrete back in the States. Cubitt grabbed Holmes by the lapels, tears streaking through the dirt on his face. "She's talking to something in the dark, Holmes. And whatever it is, it's coming to take her back." I watched Cubitt's hands as he spoke. They wouldn't stop shaking, not even when Holmes grabbed his wrists and told him to calm down. His eyes kept moving toward the sitting room door, then toward the window, then back to the red envelope. It was as if he expected someone to appear behind him. I asked him if anyone had followed him from Norfolk. He swore nobody had. Then he hesitated. That hesitation chilled me. Holmes noticed it too. He leaned forward and asked the question again, slower this time. Cubitt swallowed hard and admitted that during the journey to London, he had heard footsteps following him along the station platform. When he stopped, they stopped. When he walked, they walked. He never saw anyone. He convinced himself it was another traveler. Then, just before boarding the train, he found one of the dancing men scratched into the wooden seat beside him. Holmes became completely still. He studied the parchment again, turning it under the lamplight. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. One of the tiny figures seemed to have a line through its chest. Another had its arms raised. Another was lying upside down. They looked ridiculous, almost childish. Yet the longer I stared at them, the less innocent they seemed. They started looking like people, not drawings of people. People, waiting, watching. Holmes suddenly folded the parchment and slipped it into his pocket. "We leave tonight," he said. Cubitt stared at him. "You believe me?" Holmes looked directly into his eyes. "I believe the man who sent this wants you to believe you are losing your mind." That sentence stayed with me. Because if Holmes was right, then Elsie's madness wasn't the disease. It was the weapon. We hit Norfolk by midnight. The fog had rolled in off the coast, thick and suffocating like a wet woolen blanket draped over the entire estate of Ridling Thorpe Manor. You couldn't see 10 feet ahead of your own boots. Holmes insisted we leave the lanterns behind. No matches, no flashlights, no weapons drawn. "True terror thrives in absolute dark, Watson," Holmes muttered as we ducked behind a row of gnarled oak trees bordering the lawn. "And our intruder isn't a burglar. He's an artist of fear. He wants them to know he's near." The mansion stood like a massive black tomb against the gray sky. The wind howled through the high eaves, making the old timber structure groan like a dying ship. We crouched in the freezing mud for hours. My knees were numb, my fingers stiffened around the cold grip of my revolver. But Holmes stayed dead still, his breath coming out in slow, calculated wisps of steam. The longer we waited, the more the darkness seemed to change around us. Every branch looked like a crooked arm. Every movement of the fog looked like a person stepping closer, then disappearing. I could hear my own heartbeat inside my ears. I kept checking the mansion windows, but none of them showed a light. The whole building seemed abandoned, yet I knew Hilton and Elsie were inside. Somewhere behind those thick walls, two terrified people were trying to sleep while knowing somebody had already found a way to enter their lives. Then I heard something behind me, a faint scrape. I turned slowly. Nothing. Holmes didn't move. I leaned toward him and whispered that I had heard something. He raised one finger to his lips. His eyes remained fixed on the mansion. Then I heard it again. Scratch. Drag. Scratch. It sounded closer. I tightened my grip on the revolver, feeling the cold metal press against my palm. Every muscle in my body wanted to turn around. Holmes finally glanced at me and shook his head. Whatever was behind us, he didn't want me looking at it. Then, at precisely 1:15 a.m., the grass rustled. It wasn't the wind. It was a rhythmic, scraping sound. I peered through the brush, and my stomach dropped into my shoes. A dark figure emerged from the tree line. But the damn thing wasn't walking upright like a human being. It was crawling on all fours, dragging its abdomen through the wet grass like a wounded predator stalking its prey. Its movements were unnatural, fast, jerky, shifting from side to side in the gloom. Holmes reached out, his hand clamping down on my shoulder with a grip like iron. "Don't move," he breathed. "Watch." The creature crept up to the ground floor bedroom window, Elsie's room. It didn't break the glass. It didn't try to force the sash. Instead, it pulled something long, thin, and metallic from its coat. I could hear the thing breathing from where we stood. Slow breaths, wet breaths, almost deliberate. It paused beneath the window and tilted its head toward the room. For several seconds it didn't move at all. Then it looked directly toward us. I felt every hair on the back of my neck rise. The fog shifted between us, but for one terrible second I could see the outline of its face. It smiled. At least, I think it smiled. Holmes's fingers tightened around my shoulder until they hurt. The creature turned back toward the window as if nothing had happened. We slipped across the lawn like shadows, closing the distance until we were standing just 15 feet away, concealed by the heavy velvet drapes hanging inside the open window frame. Inside, Hilton and Elsie were asleep, or at least paralyzed by terror under their sheets. The intruder reached through the iron security bars. The moonlight hit his hand. It was covered in old, jagged scars and caked with dried dirt. In his grip was a razor-sharp hunting knife. He wasn't trying to cut their throats. With horrifying precision, he began scraping the blade directly into the wooden window frame, right above Hilton Cubitt's sleeping head. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of metal peeling wood was agonizing. He was carving a fresh sequence of dancing men into the oak, his face pressed against the glass, whispering a guttural, rhyming chant into the room while the sleeping couple breathed in his sickness. I couldn't understand the words, but Elsie did. Her eyes opened. She stared at the window. Then she began screaming without making a sound. Her mouth opened wide, but nothing came out. Her entire body shook beneath the sheets. Hilton woke beside her and immediately reached for the shotgun. The figure outside stopped carving. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the intruder slowly lifted one finger and placed it against his lips. Elsie collapsed backward. Holmes grabbed my arm. "Now," he whispered. But before we could move, the figure vanished into the fog. No footsteps, no running, nothing. Only the unfinished dancing men remained carved into the window frame, and one final scratch beneath them, a single line, pointing directly at Elsie's bed. The next morning brought no relief, only a descent into madness. A second message was found chalked across the black stone of the estate's greenhouse. Holmes locked himself inside the manor's study, bolting the heavy oak door from the inside. For 48 hours, he refused to let anyone in, including me. From outside the room, I could hear him pacing frantically, kicking furniture, mumbling incoherently in a frantic, feverish tone. He was talking to the symbols on the paper, screaming at them as if they were living, breathing entities tormenting his intellect. When I finally forced the lock and pushed the door open, the room smelled like stale tobacco, unwashed skin, and ozone. Papers were pinned to the walls with pocket knives. Charcoal drawings of stick figures covered the wallpaper from floor to ceiling. Holmes was standing in the center, his shirt torn open, his eyes wild and bloodshot, looking like a man who had stared straight into the abyss and lost his mind. I had seen men lose themselves during war. I had seen soldiers stare at nothing for hours after surviving artillery attacks. But what I saw in Holmes frightened me differently. He was still thinking, still calculating, still himself. That was what made it worse. His intelligence had not disappeared. It had become trapped inside something darker. He had covered the floor with papers. Every paper contained variations of the same dancing figures. Some were upside down. Some had been crossed out. Some had been drawn over again and again until the paper tore. Holmes looked at me, but seemed unable to recognize me for several seconds. "Do you hear them, Watson?" "Hear what?" "The feet." I listened. There was nothing. Holmes smiled. "Exactly." Before I could pull him out of his trance, a blood-curdling shriek echoed from the farmyard behind the stables. I drew my Webley revolver, and Holmes grabbed a heavy brass fireplace poker. We sprinted down the back stairs, bursting through the kitchen doors into the cold morning air. The stable boys were gathered in a circle near the tool shed, weeping, throwing up, covering their eyes. I pushed my way through the crowd, and the sight turned my blood to ice water. It was the young parlor maid, Mary. She was strapped upright to a wooden farm chair, her limbs bound tight with heavy hemp rope that bit deep into her skin. But that wasn't the horrific part. Her eyelids had been pulled back tight and pinned to her forehead with brass sewing needles, forcing her dead, glazed eyes to stay permanently open, staring directly at a small wooden blackboard resting on an easel 3 feet in front of her. On that blackboard, drawn in bright white chalk, was a fresh sequence of dancing figures. The first figure held a raised hatchet. The second was headless, lying on its side. The killer hadn't just murdered a poor servant girl. He had used her corpse as an audience for his next display of sick artistry. He wanted her to be forced to watch her own death sentence play out in chalk before her heart stopped beating. Holmes walked right up to the corpse. He didn't show an ounce of sympathy. He didn't close her eyes. He leaned down, examined the chalk dust on the floor, and sniffed the air near her mouth. "Bitter almonds," Holmes muttered, his voice dead of emotion. Cyanide forced down her throat before he pinned her eyes. "He's accelerating, Watson. He's getting bored of waiting." I looked at the blackboard again. The figures seemed different now. The first time I had seen them, they looked like symbols. Now they looked like a sequence of instructions. I counted them. There were 5. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One figure was missing. Holmes noticed it at the same moment. He slowly turned toward me. "Watson, what? How many people are currently inside this house?" I counted the servants: Hilton, Elsie, Holmes, myself. Then I understood. The sequence wasn't describing what had already happened. It was predicting what came next. The killer hadn't finished. He was showing us the order. A gust of wind swept through the farmyard, blowing chalk dust across Mary's boots. For a moment, the dust formed a thin white trail leading toward the manor. Nobody moved. Then one of the stable boys screamed. There was another message. Not on the blackboard. On the ground behind us. Fresh white chalk. A tiny dancing man. And this one was pointing toward me. After the maid's body was cleared away, the manor fell into a state of absolute psychological siege. Hilton Cubitt sat in the great hall with a double-barreled shotgun across his knees, muttering prayers, his eyes darting to every shadow that shifted in the candlelight. I went up to Elsie's room to administer a heavy dose of laudanum. She was sitting in the middle of her bed, wrapped in a blood-stained blanket, clutching a silver crucifix so tight the edges had sliced into her palms. Her skin was a sickly, translucent gray. Her lips were blue. She stared right through me, her jaw working up and down in a silent, rhythmic spasm. "He's in the house, doctor," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves blowing across concrete. "Abe Slaney, he don't leave survivors. He takes the skin, he takes the soul." I tried to reassure her, but even as I spoke, I didn't believe my own words. The room felt wrong. There was no breeze, yet the curtains moved slightly beside the window. The fire was burning low, but the temperature seemed to drop with every second. Elsie kept looking beneath the bed. I asked her what she saw. She whispered, "Nothing yet." Then she smiled. That frightened me more than her screaming. Suddenly, the ambient noise of the house died. The ticking clock on the mantel seemed to stop. From directly beneath the rug under my boots, a sound started. Scratch, drag, scratch. It was the sound of human fingernails frantically scraping against raw timber from inside the floor structure. Then came a wet, wheezing breath, a muffled voice whispering from beneath the floorboards. "Elsie, open the hatch. Elsie, the dancers want to come out." Elsie shrieked, a sound so high and unnatural it split my ears. She threw herself off the bed, thrashing on the floor in a violent grand mal seizure, foam bubbling from her lips. Holmes slammed through the door, an iron crowbar in his hand. He didn't waste time asking questions. He shoved me aside, rammed the edge of the crowbar into the seams of the hardwood floor, and put his entire weight into it. The old oak planks splintered with a loud crack, tearing up from the joists. The stench that poured out of the crawl space below was unbearable, the smell of rotting meat, damp soil, and human waste. Holmes reached his long arm down into the black hole, dragging out a heavy, burlap sack soaked in dark, viscous fluid. He dumped the contents onto the Persian rug. Out rolled a stack of thick, cured leather strips, bound together with rusty wire. But when I leaned down to inspect the material, my stomach turned over. It wasn't cowhide. The texture, the pore patterns, the distinct tattoos of anchors and eagles. It was human skin, tanned and dried, with new sequences of dancing figures branded straight into the flesh with a hot iron. The killer had brought his manifesto with him from America, carved into the hide of his previous victims. Holmes crouched over the strips in silence. He didn't touch them at first. He simply stared. I asked him how long they had been beneath the house. He didn't answer. Then he pointed toward the darkness inside the crawl space. There were footprints, bare human footprints. They disappeared beneath the house and continued toward the opposite wall. I felt my mouth go dry. "Holmes, someone has been living under here." He nodded. "Someone." Holmes looked at me. "No, Watson." He pointed toward the wall. There were dozens of scratches in the wood. Some were old, some were fresh, and among them were tiny dancing men. "Several people," he whispered. Then we heard the sound again. Scratch, drag, scratch. This time it came from inside the wall behind us. Elsie stopped breathing. Hilton shouted from the hallway. Holmes turned toward the door. The scratching moved higher. It sounded as if something was climbing through the walls. Then a soft knock came from inside the plaster. 3 slow knocks. Everyone froze. 3 more. Holmes raised his revolver. I raised mine. Elsie whispered something so quietly I almost didn't hear it. The hatch isn't under the floor. I looked at her. She was staring at the wall. It's inside the house. The scratching stopped. For several seconds, there was complete silence. Then something whispered my name from behind the wall. Watson. I had never heard that voice before, but it sounded exactly like my own. Holmes sat at the library desk, surrounded by the strips of branded skin and scrawled notes. The room was dark, save for the single green-shaded desk lamp casting long, monstrous shadows across his gaunt face. His eyes were wide, dilated, fixed on the cipher. It's a monoalphabetic substitution cipher, Watson, he explained, his voice rattling with a frantic, manic energy. Used by the joint stock mob out of Chicago, Abe Slaney's crew. But Slaney modified it. He turned a simple criminal code into an instrument of psychological destruction. The figures with flags? They represent the completion of a death sentence. Every time a flag appears, somebody dies. He pointed a bony finger at a row of figures where 3 flag bearers stood in a row. This isn't just communication. It's a mental conditioning loop designed to break the subject's sanity before execution. I stared at the cipher and felt an uncomfortable pressure building behind my eyes. The longer I looked at the figures, the more familiar they seemed. I began recognizing patterns that weren't actually there. A man with a hat, a woman standing beside him, a figure hiding behind a door. Every time I blinked, the shapes seemed to rearrange themselves. Holmes noticed. Don't stare at them too long. I looked away. Why? Because your mind wants to complete the pattern. He paused. That's precisely what Slaney wants. That explanation made the room feel smaller. Before he could continue, heavy boots rushed up the hallway. A local mail courier, dripping wet from the storm outside, knocked timidly on the door frame. He was holding a small, square cardboard box wrapped in black oilcloth, bound with heavy red twine. Telegram and package for Dr. John Watson. The boy squeaked, his knees shaking. Delivered to the local post office from Liverpool, marked urgent. I took the package. It felt surprisingly heavy for its size, cold to the touch, and gave off a faint, metallic odor. Holmes stopped talking. He stood up slowly, his eyes locked onto the box in my hands. Watson, he warned, his voice dropping an octave. Don't open that. My thumb slipped under the twine before his warning could register. The knot gave way, the cardboard flaps folded back. Inside, resting on a bed of damp wood shavings, was a freshly severed human ear, jaggedly cut at the cartilage. Wrapped around the bloody appendage was a small, parchment strip containing a short line of drawn dancing men. I dropped the box onto the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Holmes leaned over, picked up the note with his tweezers, and translated the symbols instantly out loud. Next dance is yours, Doctor. Holmes turned to me, a terrifying, ecstatic grin spreading across his face. He knows your name, Watson. He's hunting us now. Isn't it bloody glorious? I couldn't answer. My hands were shaking. Not because of the ear, because I suddenly realized the box had been addressed to me. Not Dr. Watson. John Watson. My full name. A name only a handful of people used. Holmes seemed to understand the significance. His grin faded slightly as he examined the wrapping. There was no postmark visible, no identifying mark, no indication of who had delivered it. The courier swore he had received it sealed. Then he asked the question that made my stomach turn. Sir, who is Abe Slaney? Holmes slowly looked at him. The boy's face had gone white. I've heard that name before, he whispered. Where? The boy swallowed. In the package. Holmes looked back at the box. There was something written beneath the cardboard flap. We lifted it carefully. For tiny dancing men. And beneath them, one word. Run. The courier suddenly screamed. He pointed toward the library window. A dark shape stood outside in the rain. I rushed toward the glass. Nothing. Only the garden. Only the rain. But on the outside of the window, Carved into the wet glass were 3 fresh symbols. Holmes walked beside me. He stared at them for several seconds. Then he whispered. He wasn't outside. I turned toward him. Then where was he? Holmes looked toward the library door. Inside. We had to retreat to London for 12 hours to pull Slaney's criminal profile from Scotland Yard's secret international telegram registry. But the moment we stepped back into 221B, Baker Street, Holmes completely disintegrated. The strain of processing the psychopathic cipher was ripping his mind apart. He locked himself in his bedchamber, dragging a heavy wardrobe across the door to block entry. From inside, the sounds were nightmarish, glass shattering against the walls, with splintering, and Holmes screaming full-throated gibberish in various languages. I stood outside the door with a heavy brass poker, my heart in my throat. "Holmes," I yelled, slamming my shoulder against the oak panel. "Open this damn door before I blow the lock off." No answer, just a low, wet, guttural laugh that didn't sound human. I waited. Nothing. Then I heard Holmes whispering. He was talking to someone. At first I thought he was speaking to himself, but there was a second voice answering him. A quiet voice, almost impossible to hear. I pressed my ear against the door. Holmes said, "You cannot hide from me." The other voice answered, "You cannot hide from yourself." I pulled away from the door. My blood went cold. I dropped to my knees and peered through the brass keyhole. What I saw shocked me to my very core. Holmes had stripped off his shirt and coat. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of a shattered full-length mirror. In his right hand, he held a surgical scalpel. With horrifying, methodical precision, he was cutting shallow lines into his own chest and arms, carving the exact shapes of the dancing men into his skin. Blood was dripping down his torso, pooling in the waist of his trousers. He was laughing, muttering under his breath. To catch the beast, you must become the canvas, feel the cuts, hear the music, dance, little men, dance. He was in a state of full-blown psychotic dissociation, driven over the edge by his obsession with Slaney's code. But there was something else in the room, something I couldn't explain. The broken mirror reflected Holmes from several different angles. In one reflection, he was sitting perfectly still. In another, his head was turned toward the door. In another, he was smiling directly at me. I knew that wasn't possible. I blinked. The reflections returned to normal. I kicked the door frame until the iron latch gave way, bursting into the room. Holmes whipped around like a cornered animal. His eyes were completely black, his pupils dilated to the rim, his face smeared with sweat and blood. He lunged at me with the scalpel, his movement ridiculously fast. I ducked, grabbing his wrist and slamming him against the wall. We struggled in the dark, slipping on his blood, until I managed to pin his arms and knock the scalpel from his grip. He gasped, his body going completely limp in my arms. His eyes slowly cleared, looking up at me in utter confusion. "Watson," he whispered, his voice trembling like a frightened child's. What have I done?" I didn't answer. I just bandaged his wounds in silence, realizing for the first time that the line between Sherlock Holmes and the monsters he hunted was thinner than a razor's edge. Holmes stared at his own hands. Then he looked at the mirror. "Watson." "Yes." "Don't look at it." I turned toward the shattered glass anyway. There were dancing men scratched across the mirror. I knew they hadn't been there before. Holmes had not drawn them. At least, not all of them. One figure stood apart from the others. It was holding a flag. Holmes's face changed. "How many flags?" I counted. 1, then 2, then 3. My throat tightened. 3. Holmes slowly closed his eyes. 3 deaths. Mary was one. "Yes." "Elsie." He opened his eyes. "No." His voice was almost a whisper. "Hilton." A cold silence filled the room. Then something knocked from inside the wall. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. Holmes and I looked at each other. Another 3 knocks came from the ceiling. Then from beneath the floor. The sound moved through the house, like something crawling through its bones. Holmes slowly stood. He looked exhausted, wounded, almost broken. But his eyes had become clear again. "The game has changed, Watson." What do you mean? He looked at the dancing men carved into the mirror. We were never chasing Slaney. He wiped the blood from his mouth. Slaney has been chasing us. And somewhere downstairs, the front door slowly opened. A frantic telegram arrived from the local Norfolk constable at dawn. Come at once. Hubert has lost control. Gunshots heard near Manor. We caught the express train out of Liverpool Street Station. The sky was dark, bruised purple, dumping buckets of freezing rain over the countryside. We hired a high-wheeled closed carriage at the local station, the driver whipping the two horses into a frantic gallop down the narrow, muddy country lanes. The wind was howling so hard it felt like it was going to flip the carriage right into the ditches. Holmes sat across from me, his chest wrapped tight in linen bandages under his dark coat. He was deadly silent, clutching his heavy cane, his face set like granite. Something about his silence bothered me. Holmes usually filled dangerous journeys with theories, deductions, or some sarcastic remark designed to keep my nerves from getting the better of me. This time he said nothing. He stared through the rain-covered window as if he expected to see somebody standing among the trees. Every few seconds his fingers tightened around the cane. I asked him what he was thinking, but he only looked at me and said, "Listen to the road, Watson." I listened. Beneath the pounding rain and the violent rhythm of the wheels, I could hear another sound, faint and irregular, almost like footsteps keeping pace with the carriage. We were 3 miles from the manor, passing through a dense, pitch-black patch of pine woods known as Blackshuck Woods. Suddenly, loud cracks echoed through the timber. Bang, bang, bang. High-caliber rifle fire erupted from the tree. The carriage windows shattered, showering us with deadly glass shrapnel. The wooden side door was peppered with heavy lead slugs that tore through the panels like wet tissue paper. I grabbed Holmes and shoved him down onto the floorboards as a bullet whizzed inches over my head, embedding itself in the roof. Outside, the driver let out a choked, gurgling scream. A round had struck him square in the throat, blowing out his jugular. His dead body fell off the bench, dragging the reins down with him. For one terrible second, the horses kept moving without a driver. The carriage continued forward while the dead man's boots scraped against the wheels. I could hear the body dragging somewhere outside, but I couldn't see it through the shattered glass. Holmes remained on the floor, completely calm. That calm frightened me more than the gunfire. His eyes were focused on the darkness beyond the broken window. It felt as though he was waiting for another shot, almost inviting the sniper to reveal himself. The horses went mad with terror, bolted off the road, and dragged the heavy carriage toward the edge of a 60-foot ravine. The vehicle swayed violently, wheels grinding against boulders, ready to flip into the rocky chasm below. Most men would scream, pray, or freeze in blind panic. But Holmes, he kicked the broken door wide open, threw his upper body out into the storm, and grabbed the dangling reins with his bare, bleeding hands. He braced his boots against the iron frame, his teeth bared, laughing insanely into the thunderous dark. He fired 3 rapid shots from his revolver into the brush to suppress the sniper, pulling the horses back onto the road just inches from the cliff edge. He turned back to me, his hair wild, blood dripping from his palms. "Slaney's getting sloppy, Watson. He's shooting at the audience instead of finishing the play." I stared into the trees. The gunfire had stopped. There was no return shot, no movement, nothing. That silence felt deliberate. Holmes climbed back inside and wiped the blood from his hands. Then he looked toward the woods and smiled faintly. He wanted us frightened. Why? Because frightened men make mistakes. I looked back into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale face between 2 pine trunks. I blinked. It was gone. Holmes saw my expression. "You saw him too, didn't you?" I didn't answer. The carriage rolled forward. Behind us, somewhere deep inside Blackshuck Woods, 3 slow rifle shots echoed in the distance. Not aimed at us, almost like a signal. And somehow I knew they were meant to tell someone that we had survived. We abandoned the wrecked carriage and sprinted the final mile on foot, our boots sinking deep into the freezing mud. By the time we reached the iron gates of Riddling Thorpe Manor, the front doors were hanging wide open, swinging violently back and forth in the gale. The house was dead quiet, no servants screaming, no dogs barking. The heavy scent of cordite, blood, and burnt grease hit us the second we stepped into the grand foyer. It was thicker than a fog, choking the back of my throat. I drew my service revolver, keeping my thumb on the hammer, while Holmes moved ahead like a ghost, his footfalls making zero sound on the marble floor. The silence inside the manor was unnatural. After the violence we had just survived outside, I expected shouting, footsteps, panic, anything. Instead, the house seemed to be holding its breath. Even the storm outside sounded distant once we crossed the threshold. I could hear water dripping from my coat onto the marble floor. Each drop echoed through the foyer like a clock counting down towards something neither of us could see. Holmes stopped near the staircase. He raised one hand. I froze. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He was staring at the floor. There were muddy footprints leading toward the stairs. Only one set. They stopped halfway up. There was no return trail. We followed the trail of fresh blood up the main staircase. Drops of dark crimson were splashed across the white balustrade. Leads up to the master bedroom suite. The door was half off its hinges, splintered around the lock frame. Holmes kicked it open. The scene inside was an absolute slaughterhouse, the culmination of days of psychological torture. Hilton Cubitt lay flat on his back in the center of the room, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the ceiling. A massive entry wound burned through the center of his chest, his waistcoat soaked through with thick, blackening blood that had pooled around his body, drowning the expensive oriental rug. His right hand was still locked around the grip of a fired revolver, its barrel still smoking faint wisps of blue-gray smoke. I had seen men die on battlefields. I had seen bodies torn apart by artillery. But Hilton's expression disturbed me more than the wound. He looked terrified, not angry, not surprised, terrified. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling as though he had seen something there in his final seconds. I slowly looked upward. Nothing, only plaster. Yet I couldn't stop imagining a face staring down through the darkness above us. 5 feet away, slumping against the base of the heavy mahogany wardrobe, was Elsie. She wasn't dead yet, but she was real close. A heavy lead bullet had grazed her skull, tearing open her scalp from forehead to ear. Blood covered her entire face like a gruesome red mask, dripping down her chin onto her nightgown. But the most horrifying aspect of the room wasn't the bodies, it was the walls. Every single square inch of the bedroom wallpaper, from the floorboards up to the crown molding, had been covered in fresh, wet stick figures. The killer had used Hilton Cubitt's arterial blood as ink, finger-painting hundreds of dancing men across the room while his victim lay dying on the floor. It was a visual explosion of absolute, unadulterated madness. I stepped closer to the wall. The figures seemed to move beneath the flickering light from the hallway. I knew they weren't moving. My mind knew that. But my eyes kept finding new positions for their tiny arms and legs. One figure appeared to be pointing toward the bed. Another seemed to be pointing toward Elsie. Another appeared to be pointing directly at me. I stepped backward. Holmes noticed. Do not trust what your eyes are telling you. Why? Because whoever made this room wants your mind to finish the picture. Then Elsie moved. Her fingers twitched against the floor. I rushed toward her. Her eyes opened for 1 second. She looked directly at me. Then she whispered one word. Window. I turned. The window was open. Rain blew through the broken frame. And on the wet sill were fresh, muddy fingerprints. Someone had been standing there, watching, waiting, the entire time. I dropped my revolver and dropped to my knees beside Elsie. Her pulse was thready, fluttering like a dying moth's wing. Her breath was coming in terrible, wet rattles, a classic sign of massive cranial trauma. I ripped off my neckcloth, pressing it hard against the gaping wound on her skull to stanch the arterial flow, yelling for the local constable who had finally ambled up the driveway. "Get hot water, bandages, and brandy," I roared over my shoulder. "She's bleeding out." But Holmes completely ignored the dying woman. He ignored her husband's corpse. He didn't check for a pulse. He didn't even look at the blood pooling around his boots. He walked straight to the wall, pulled his magnifying glass from his coat pocket, and pressed his face against the bloody drawings. He was tracing the wet crimson lines with his bare fingers, his jaw tight, his breath hitching in his chest. "Magnificent," Holmes whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying blend of horror and intellectual ecstasy. "Look at the sequence, Watson. Look at the spacing of the flag bearers." I looked up from Elsie's bleeding skull, furious. "For God's sake, Holmes. A man is dead and his wife is dying. Stop staring at the damn doodles." Holmes snapped his head toward me, his eyes cold and hollow like two glass marbles. "You don't understand, Watson. Slaney didn't pull the trigger on Hilton Cubitt. Hilton shot himself, and then he shot his wife." I froze, my blood running cold. Holmes pointed his magnifying glass at the final sequence painted in blood above the bed frame. The final cipher. It wasn't a threat. It was a hypnotic psychological command. A suicide-packed instruction coded into their subconscious over 7 days of sleep deprivation and terror. Slaney didn't need to break into the room tonight. He stood outside that open window, whistled the cipher rhythm, and watched through the glass as Cubitt lost his mind, raised his gun, shot his wife, and then put a bullet through his own heart. Slaney turned a man into his own executioner without ever laying a finger on him. The explanation made the room feel colder. I looked at Hilton again. His fingers were still wrapped around the revolver. His face was frozen in terror. And suddenly I wondered what he had been hearing before he died. What had Slaney whispered through that window? What had those dancing figures forced Hilton to see in his final moments? Elsie's eyes opened again. She stared at Holmes. Her lips moved. I leaned closer. "Don't." Her voice was barely audible. "Don't what?" She looked toward the bloody wall. "Listen." I felt a chill move through me. There was nothing to listen to. Then Holmes raised his head. He had heard it too. A faint rhythm. 3 soft taps against the window. Then 2. Then 3 again. The same rhythm as the dancing figures. Holmes's expression changed. He walked toward the window and stared into the storm. No one was there, but the wet glass was trembling slightly. I could hear a faint whistle outside. The melody was simple, almost childish. Yet the moment I heard it, my thoughts became strangely difficult to control. For a second I forgot where I was. I forgot Elsie. I forgot Hilton. I forgot the constable standing behind me. I could only hear the rhythm. Holmes suddenly slammed the window shut. The trance broke. I gasped. He turned toward me. "That is the weapon. The whistle. The pattern." He looked at the bloody figures again. Once the mind learns the sequence, it begins completing it without permission. I looked at the wall. For the first time, I understood the true horror of Slaney's method. He didn't need to be inside the room. He only needed to get inside the mind. By 3 a.m., the local doctor had taken Elsie away on a stretcher, her life hanging by a thread. The local constable was shaking like a leaf, staring at Hilton's sheet-covered corpse lying in the corner of the blood-drenched room. Holmes didn't waste a second. He sat down at the writing desk in the corner, ignoring the blood dripping from his own linen bandages. He pulled out a sheet of heavy cream stationery and a fountain pen filled with India ink. With swift, practiced strokes, he drew a long line of dancing men across the paper, a sequence he had crafted in his own mind, utilizing Slaney's exact cipher system. He folded the note, sealed it with red wax, and called the terrified stable boy into the room. The kid took one look at the bloody room and looked ready to faint. Holmes grabbed the boy by his collar, pulling his face inches from his own. "Take this note," Holmes commanded in a harsh, mesmerizing whisper. "Run to Elridge's farm at the edge of the parish. Ask for the American gentleman, Mr. Abe Slaney. Deliver this letter directly into his hands. Tell him it comes from Mrs. Cubitt and that she is waiting for him alone in the master bedroom. Do not say another word. or I will ensure you end up like the master of this house." "Understood." The boy nodded frantically and bolted down the stairs into the storm. I watched the boy disappear through the doorway. For a moment, Holmes remained motionless. "You threatened him. Fear makes people obedient." I didn't like the answer. Neither did I like the expression on his face. Holmes looked almost excited. The murder had affected him in a way I could barely understand. It was as though every death pushed him closer to Slaney instead of driving him away. The more horrifying the crime became, the more alive Holmes seemed. He turned toward the dead man's covered body. "Slaney thinks fear belongs to him, and you intend to prove him wrong." "No, Watson." Holmes looked at the blood-soaked floor. "I intend to make him afraid." Holmes turned off all the oil lamps in the manor, plunging the murder house into absolute, suffocating darkness. We sat down in 2 armchairs inside the master bedroom, positioned right beside Hilton Cubitt's cold corpse. The rain beat against the window panes like thrown gravel. The stench of copper and death hung heavy in the pitch-black room. I cocked the hammer of my Webley, resting it on my knee. Holmes sat completely motionless beside me, his breathing so slow and shallow I couldn't even hear him. We sat in that dark graveyard for 1 full hour, waiting for the monster to walk straight into the trap engineered by his own dark art. The first 10 minutes felt like an eternity, then 20, then 30. Every sound became enormous. The house creaked. The roof groaned. Water moved through the gutters. Once, I heard footsteps downstairs. I raised my revolver. Holmes touched my wrist. "Not yet." The footsteps stopped. Then came a faint scraping sound from the hallway. Slow, deliberate. Scratch, drag, scratch. I stared into the darkness. "Holmes." I heard it. The sound stopped outside the bedroom. We waited. Nothing happened. Then the door moved. Only an inch. I could see the thin line of darkness beyond it. Holmes raised his revolver. The door slowly opened another inch, then stopped. No one entered. The silence became unbearable. I realized I had stopped breathing. Holmes leaned toward me and whispered the words that chilled me more than the darkness. "He wants us to think he's here." "Then where is he?" Holmes stared toward the open doorway. "Where he has always been." I felt my stomach tighten. "Where?" Holmes looked toward the window, watching. The heavy iron front door downstairs creaked open. Heavy, unhurried footsteps echoed through the empty ground floor. Thud, thud, thud. This wasn't a thief sneaking around. This was a man walking into a domain he believed he owned. He climbed the stairs slowly, his boots crushing splinters of glass from the shattered lamps on the steps. He reached the landing, paused for a moment, and then stepped through the broken door frame into the pitch-black master bedroom. He smelled of cheap cigars, wet horse, and stale rye whiskey. A big, imposing silhouette stood framed against the dim light filtering from the hallway moon. It was Abe Slaney. He was built like a brick wall, with broad shoulders, a dark beard trimmed to a sharp point, and cold, dead eyes that had never shown a drop of human pity. He took 2 steps into the room, his voice booming out in a rich, gravelly American drawl. "Elsie, come on out, girl. You sent the note. The old man's out of the picture now. It's time to go home to Chicago." Suddenly, Holmes struck a match. The bright yellow flame flared up, illuminating the room in a grotesque, flickering light. It lit up the walls dripping with blood, the sheet-covered corpse of Hilton Cubitt on the floor, and Holmes sitting in his chair, a heavy revolver leveled straight at Slaney's chest. "Mrs. Cubitt isn't available, Mr. Slaney," Holmes said, his voice cold as a razor blade. "But her husband's ghost has been dying to meet you." Slaney didn't panic. That was the first thing I noticed. Most men confronted with a dead body, a dark room, and a revolver pointed at their chest would show fear. Slaney simply stared at Holmes. His eyes moved slowly across the room. He studied the walls, the corpse, Elsie's empty bed, then Holmes. He looked almost disappointed. Slaney didn't panic. He didn't drop his hands. A slow, sickening smirk spread across his broad face, revealing yellowed, crooked teeth. He reached slowly toward his coat pocket. Well, Slaney sneered. spitting a glob of dark tobacco juice onto the carpet near Cubit's head. "If it ain't the hotshot London detective." He sneered. "You think you caught me, boy? I didn't shoot that old fool. He drew on me, and he shot his own broad. My hands are clean. You got nothing on me but some child's drawings on a wall." He let out a deep, booming laugh that vibrated off the bloody plaster. The laugh of an absolute psychopath who believed he was completely untouchable by human law. Holmes didn't react. That seemed to bother Slaney. The laughter faded. The room became silent again. Holmes slowly lifted the match toward the wall. The tiny flame illuminated the dancing men. Hundreds of them. Slaney stared. His expression changed. Only slightly. But Holmes noticed. "You recognize them?" Slaney's jaw tightened. "No. You do." I said no. Holmes smiled. Then he pointed toward one figure near the ceiling. "That one was never part of your original cipher." Slaney stared at it. For the first time, genuine confusion crossed his face. I looked too. The figure was different from the others. Its arms were raised. Its head was turned sideways, and it seemed to be facing Slaney. Slaney took one step backward. Holmes watched him carefully. "You built the language." Holmes's voice became softer. "But you never understood what it could do to you." Slaney's breathing changed. He reached inside his coat. I raised my Webley. Holmes did not move. "Take your hand out slowly, Abe." Slaney froze. For several seconds nobody moved. Then Slaney smiled again. But this time the smile looked forced. And I realized something. For the first time that night, Abe Slaney was afraid. Holmes didn't pull the trigger. He didn't shout. He slowly stood up, keeping his revolver trained on the space between Slaney's eyes. He began to walk around the giant American, his voice dropping into a rhythmic, terrifying monotone. "You think you're a mastermind, Abe." Holmes began, his tone dripping with utter contempt. "You think you created a code that makes you a god over lesser men. But you're not a god. You're a pathetic, low-rent thug from the Chicago slums who got lucky with a simple substitution cipher. You used it to terrorize a helpless woman because you couldn't handle the fact that she chose an honest man over a bottom-feeding parasite like you." Slaney's smirk began to vanish. His knuckles turned white as he clenched his fists. Holmes stepped closer, pointing his finger at the blood-painted walls. "I decoded your stupid little men in 2 hours, Slaney. It was child's play, an insult to my intellect. I used your own cipher to write the note that brought you here tonight. You marched 3 miles through a freezing storm like a trained dog responding to a dog whistle. I didn't trap you with guns, Abe. I trapped you with your own pathetic vanity. You fell for the simplest trick in the book because your ego couldn't accept that someone else mastered your little toy." The psychological attack hit Slaney harder than a lead bullet. His grand delusion of intellectual superiority crumbled in seconds. His eyes went wide, filled with a sudden, wild rage. He began to hyperventilate, his breathing ragged and shallow. "No, no," Slaney screamed, losing his mind completely. "It's my code. My men. You don't know nothing." In a fit of complete psychotic panic, Slaney reached into his coat, pulled out the paper note Holmes had sent him, shoved it into his mouth, and began chewing frantically, trying to swallow the ink and paper to destroy the evidence. He fell to his knees, clawing at his own throat, gagging and choking as the local police rushed into the room and pinned his massive frame to the blood-stained floorboards. But Holmes wasn't finished. He crouched beside Slaney. The giant American thrashed beneath the constable's grip, his face twisted with panic. Holmes looked directly into his eyes. "You know what the worst part is, Abe?" Slaney stared at him. Holmes held up one of the cipher strips. "You taught everyone to fear these little men." He placed the strip on the floor. "But now you fear them yourself." Slaney's breathing became faster. He looked toward the walls. The dancing figures surrounded him. For the first time, they seemed to have become prisoners instead of weapons. Slaney shook his head. "Stop looking at me." Holmes didn't move. "I haven't touched you." "Stop looking at me." "I haven't threatened you." Slaney's eyes darted around the room. "Make them stop." The constable looked confused. I looked at Holmes. Holmes simply watched him. "What do you see, Abe?" Slaney stared at the walls. "They're moving." I looked at the figures. They were perfectly still. Slaney began trembling violently. "They're dancing." Holmes leaned closer. "Of course they are." Slaney screamed. "No." Holmes stood. "The mind is a wonderful prison, Abe. You spent 7 days teaching Elsie how to fear your symbols. Tonight, you taught yourself the same lesson." Slaney began laughing and crying at the same time. The police dragged him toward the door, but as he passed the bloody wall, he suddenly stopped. His face went completely white. He stared at one final figure near the floor. Then he whispered, "That's not mine." Holmes looked down. The figure had no flag. It was holding a knife, and beneath it was another tiny drawing. A man lying on the floor. Slaney stared at Holmes. "Who drew that?" Holmes didn't answer. For several seconds, even Slaney seemed to forget the police were holding him. Then Holmes slowly looked at me. I knew from his expression that he had no answer, and that frightened me more than anything Slaney had said. Abe Slaney was tried at the Norwich Assizes and sentenced to swing by the neck until dead. Elsie survived the gunshot wound to her head, but her mind was permanently broken. She never spoke another word for the rest of her natural life, spending her days sitting in a padded room in a private asylum, staring blankly out the window, her fingers twitching in her lap as if tracing invisible patterns in the air. The case was officially closed by Scotland Yard, recorded as a brilliant triumph of deductive logic by the great Sherlock Holmes. The newspapers hailed him as a hero, but I knew the horrific truth. We returned to 221B, Baker Street, 3 days later. The London rain was falling again, washing the grime down the glass panes of our sitting room. I sat in my armchair, trying to write down the official account of the case, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mary's pinned eyelids, Hilton's blasted chest, and the blood-painted walls of Riddling Thorpe Manor. I looked across the room at Holmes. He was sitting at his desk, draped in his dark dressing gown. He hadn't touched his violin. He hadn't taken his pipe. He was staring straight at the blank plaster wall above the fireplace. I wanted to believe it was over. I wanted to believe that Slaney was behind bars, that Elsie was alive, and that the dancing men were nothing more than a clever psychological weapon created by a criminal mind. But I couldn't forget what Slaney had said. "That's not mine." The words followed me back to London. They followed me into my sleep. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night convinced I could hear that same faint rhythm from Riddling Thorpe Manor. 3 taps, then 2, then 3. I would sit in bed holding my revolver and listen until dawn. Nothing ever happened. At least, nothing I could prove. In his right hand, he held a piece of black charcoal. With slow, hypnotic movements, Holmes was drawing the dancing men across our sitting room wall. The figures were inverted, holding flags, dancing in a twisted, horrific line that stretched from the mantelpiece to the door. He didn't turn around when I called his name. He just kept scrawling, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that echoes in my nightmares to this very day. "They never stop dancing, Watson. Once you learn the steps, you dance until you die." I stood behind him. "Holmes." He continued drawing. I looked at the wall. There were dozens of figures now. Some were the same figures we had seen at Riddling Thorpe Manor. Others were new. One of them was holding a revolver. Another was lying beneath it, and another was standing beside a window. I felt the blood drain from my face. "Holmes, when did you draw these?" He stopped. Very slowly, he turned his head toward me. I didn't. Neither of us spoke. Holmes looked back at the wall. His hand was still holding the charcoal. Then he noticed the final figure. It had been drawn behind his chair. A tiny man with a raised flag. Holmes stepped backward. For the first time since I had known him, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. The charcoal slipped from his fingers. It struck the floor. Neither of us moved. Then came a sound from the hallway. Scratch. Drag. Scratch. The same sound we had heard beneath the floorboards. Holmes slowly reached for his revolver. I raised mine. The hallway remained empty. The scratching stopped. Then a tiny line appeared across the fresh charcoal drawing. Not written by Holmes. Not written by me. A new dancing man appeared on the wall, and this one was pointing directly at us. Holmes stared at it for several seconds. Then he whispered, "Watson, yes. Whatever happens." He looked at me. "Do not learn the next step." The lights went out, and somewhere inside 221B, Baker Street, something began to dance.